thank you for your consideration as we changed the date kind of last minute last week. We're glad you could join us this week. We sure appreciate it. But you are joining us for the September episode of the Forest Health Workshop, Winter Preparation for Trees in South Dakota. Joining us as always, Dr. John Ball, Forest Health Specialist and SDSU Professor and Extension Forester. Thank you, John, for joining us. We do have just a couple of ground housekeeping things to go over. The meeting is being recorded. This recording will be put on our YouTube page and our department website for future viewing. We also encourage participation. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat box. We'll make sure to go through those questions and answer them. We should have time at the end of the discussion to have some open conversation. So if you are a certified forester or an ISA certified arborist, please stay tuned. I know certified foresters for SAF, please put your credentials in the chat box. Dr. Ball did have a ISA certification at the end of his presentation for those arborists in the audience today. But with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ball. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, hey, thank you, Tony, and thanks to everybody. I'll start sharing the screen here now, and we'll see if we can get it started. All right. Let's see. There we go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's either noon or 1 for most folks watching this today here. And what I'm going to go over is a little bit of what you might want to start thinking about for winter. Now, Tony and I may do more details later on this fall, but a lot's been happening in the last month here. And first we thought maybe a review of the pests, but so much has happened in the last month in terms of what's going on with high temperatures and that. We thought, well, let's go over what are we doing for winter, because winter is coming, despite the fact we're probably looking at some 80-degree days here in the next week or so in South Dakota, at least. Well, I'm getting lots and lots of calls, and I'm sure when I looked at the list of people that are participating today, I know there's a lot of you that are getting these calls as well. People are noticing their tree leaves that they're dropping prematurely. They've got all these dots or blotches on them, and they're saying, well, what's wrong with my tree? And either you send pictures to me or you send samples or you figure it out. A problem such as apple scab. And interesting enough, West River's actually seen it this year because of the abundant rain they've had. And people want to know, what can you do? Well, for a lot of our disease problems, there's nothing you can do at this time of year. At this time of year, really sanitation is the one thing. And by that, you'll often see the recommendations for leaf diseases. They overwinter in the fallen leaves. And so one of the common recommendations is to go out there and rake up all the fallen leaves. You'd have to be a pretty bored individual to do that. So while that might be helpful, I wouldn't suggest doing it over any particular size of property. And I might mention, if you did it on your property, your neighbors didn't do it on theirs, really you haven't done much. But fortunately, if you go out there and just mow, and a lot of us are still mowing because we've had some rains and it's still warm out there, mowing will grind up the leaves and it'll decompose quicker. And if you still have some leaves on there in the spring, just mow. If you mow them up so they decompose faster, that's really your best means for sanitation. Now, I might mention, though, that we do have some other problems out there, and that's with fruit. That's an apple maggot coming out of an apple. That's the classic picture of the worm inching its way out of the fruit. And they do fall to the ground in the fruit, and then they crawl out of it. Now, usually they crawl out of it within a couple of days of the fruit landing. But one of the things you might consider is, if you're dealing with apple trees, is when the fruit drops, clean it up within a day or two. Don't say, well, we'll get to it in a week or so, because some of the insects that will fall out of it will now be in the soil. And so really right now at this time of year, sanitation is really what we're focused on in terms of pest management. You know, if you can mow down those fallen leaves, pick up any fallen fruit, and that's really about it till next spring. But there are some insects we can manage at this time, but we'll chat about those probably next month because those are kind of a late season activity. I do want to point out, though, I'm getting calls on premature fall color. I've been getting calls for the last couple of weeks. Why are the leaves turning yellow? Or why are the leaves even turning red? Well, we haven't had the sort of temperatures that we would expect fall color to occur at. What you really need for good fall color is, first of all, sunny days. We've had those, but we also need frosts, and we haven't had those. In fact, I was watching Kettleland News, and it's looking like we may even go a couple more weeks without really any heavy frosts. So what you're seeing right now is a response to drought. And if I go down into southeastern South Dakota, I can find a lot of fall color. In fact, I had someone even mention that to me as we were driving around looking at trees. And boy, look at all the fall color. I said, that's really not fall color. What's happening is the trees are responding with this color change because they're losing their normal pigment, that the green, the chlorophyll, because the plant is stressed. So right now, while yeah, there are a few plants that normally turn color this early, in a lot of cases, you're looking at stress, not the normal color change. The other response we're seeing is we're getting a lot of spring flowering shrubs that are blooming right now.
Huh.
Lilac is flowering. I'm getting calls from a number of people say, well, the lilacs are blooming. In fact, I was driving over by Lake Benton yesterday, and I looked at an entire row of lilacs that was in complete bloom. And crab apples, lilacs, magnolias, viburnums. I've had these in my pest alert last week. But what you're seeing here is spring flowering shrubs that have already set their flower buds for next year in response to the change in weather. They went through a drought. It was hot and dry, and then we've actually had some rains. In fact, some actually fairly good rains. Not enough to make up the deficit, but enough to really shock the plant. And so they're not responding to the fact that it was cold and then warm as you would through the winter. They're responding to the fact it was dry, now it's wet. And so I'm not seeing this much West River just because it's been a whole wet season.
Oh, Jack.
But East River, particularly down in the southeastern part of the state, you're going to see, or you have seen, lilacs in
Come here, I'll
complete
give
bloom, as well as a number of these other plants. It tends to be these, the crab apples, more than the apples, but they are close related, of course. It's mostly the size of the fruit. Lilacs, absolutely. Magnolias, there's one in bloom right now in Brookings, and I've seen a lot of viburnums flowering as well. So, and it has to be a spring flowering shrub. Summer flowering, they're pretty much done. But and what does this mean to the plant? Actually, not that much. What flowers you see mean that's fewer flowers you'll see next year because they're not going to set new flower buds. So that hedge that I saw yesterday, that was in complete bloom. I rarely see that. Next spring, they're not going to have flowers on their lilacs. But for most of the plants that I've seen, it's a few blossoms here and there, just enough for you to notice and say, why is it blooming? Well, it's blooming in response to the abrupt change in moisture, dry to moist. But even that moisture, it's been bone dry for most of the eastern part of our state this year. In fact, I've looked at lots and lots of small trees out there that I get the call, why is my tree not doing well? And the typical symptoms that you're seeing is that it's the older foliage is a little discolored, maybe turning a little bit of red even to it. Certainly yellows, maybe just an off green. And then I put my hand in the soil and it's like powder. and it should never be like powder. And so I've looked at a lot of small trees, small belts in that, and the real problem in the eastern part of the state, in particularly the southeastern part of our state, is drought. If you haven't looked at the map for this year, and this I drew from the drought map from the drought monitoring for the United States, and in our state this year it's flipped over from past years where usually the west is dry and the east is at least normal rainfall. But now we've got this peninsula of abnormally dry conditions going all the way out to the eastern end of Pennington County, and then moderate drought throughout this wide area in mostly the southeast, and then a severe area drought that really focuses a little bit up on the northeast and then centers on Brookings County. Now, I might mention too why the counties of Clay County, Union County, Yankton County are now out of severe drought, which they were all summer. They're still under moderate drought in some places and abnormally dry. They have not come out of it. And last year they were under drought conditions as well. So in the southeast, this is 2 years of abnormally dry to severe drought conditions. How do you get around that? Well, quite frankly, if you've got a shelter belt, you're irrigating. And I've been impressed with the number of belts that I'm seeing out there that they have drip irrigation for. I think maybe 20 years ago, it was rare for me to see a shelter belt that someone had installed that actually had irrigation planned for. And then those were typically West River. Now I'm seeing it more throughout the state, including East River, and those belts are green. Now I want you to look at this picture. You look outside of the belt, nothing's coming up. It's been that dry this year. You're not even getting weeds. But the trees in the belt, just that beautiful normal green. Another example here of another belt with great irrigation on here. And take a look what we have here for the typical recommendations. 8 gallons a week per seedling. And then 12 gallons a week for the next 4 years. So you want to bump it up a little as the plant gets bigger. This particular belt, and look at it. The lilacs you're seeing there, just bright green as could be. Everything else around it is brown. This particular one that I went to, they're getting 12 gallons a week. Every plant, 12 gallons a week. And if you take a look at what July was like, some of these areas had barely any rain at all. So for all those folks in the conservation district that are viewing this today, and I could see a large number you were on, you know, when you're responding to those, well, why didn't my seedlings do well this year? Why did I get this dieback? It was bad stock. It was planted wrong. No, it's called drought conditions. And unfortunately, there's districts can't do much about that except encourage drip irrigation. I know it's an additional cost to the landowner, but just like fabric, it's one of the things we do to ensure good establishment. You know, nobody benefits from having to go out and replace 3/4 of a belt the following year. And I know under drought conditions, it's even hard to get people to think about putting shelter belts in. But I'm pleased to see more irrigation going. And remember, you're going to be irrigating for several years. Now, by year 5, they're on their own. You know, you chose plants that are adapted to that location, so they should be able to take the normal range or fluctuations we get in precipitation during the summer. But for this year and last year, in many areas of the state, we weren't getting normal precipitation. And so the belts that have done the best are the ones that have drip irrigation. What I'm afraid we're going to see next year is what we saw this year. We have a dry fall, and we're going to go into winter that the forecast right now is warmer than normal. Now, that might be nice for us and our heating bills, but it's going to be tough on plants. On the whole eastern side of the state, you could drive down and look at maple trees that you could literally draw a line across them. There's a road in Brookings, South Dakota that I can drive down, and there's a line of maple trees, and it's almost like someone took a ruler and went right down the whole line, and the tops are dead. Maples, and it just occurred in a lot, perhaps not every one, but the calls I'm still getting, why is the top of my maple dead? Well, it's dead because of last year we had a dry fall and then a long winter. And trees that are very, very sensitive to desiccation injury, maples, and then I might add birches. There's a lot of birches, the top are dead. The tops will just dry out and they die. Now, these same trees are very sensitive to being in the coolers very long. They'll desiccate in coolers. And when I used to work at nurseries, maples and birch were two trees you didn't want to leave in the cooler too long. I mean, they could last the usual planting season. You could pull them out of the cooler and put them in the ground in May, even a little early June. But their shelf life wasn't nearly as good as some other trees. And so these are the same ones that we're seeing injury this year. So how do you get around this? Water. Watering in the fall is essential. Now, if we get an inch of rain, you don't need to water. But if you don't have an inch of rain and you're in the areas that are subject to drought right now, if the trees aren't going to do well next year, and the younger the tree, the more likely you're going to see injury just because they don't have a well-established root system, expect to see some dieback. Now, we're going to see it on evergreens too. This was what I saw on arborvitae this last spring, mostly on the south side, but you can take a look at this entire row, and as you can see, the younger trees were the ones that were most affected, or the younger shrubs in this case were the ones that were most affected. Arborvitae is very sensitive to this. They really demand moisture, and if they go into the fall dry and they go into a warm winter, we're going to see a lot of dieback. I can almost count the years that over the last 30 or 40 years working in this region that I see combinations like this. And again, our current setup, it's been dry fall, warm winter, is going to come out as more winter injury next spring. Now, we get people that'll wrap them. Sometimes that's just plain ugly. We plant evergreens because you want them to look nice in the winter. And if you go out and everything's covered like this, that really doesn't look that good. Don't tightly wrap them like this one poor shrub here. Looks like some bizarre snowman. What's going to happen? That literally will trap moisture, and you're going to get ice build up on the inside of that burlap and that. You can actually end up breaking branches, believe it or not. If you want to protect them, you can use screening like that little box picture that you see there. Notice it's open on one side. The side that's facing the south, where the sun's hitting it, is where you've got the screen. That will help. I'll admit it takes away from the winter appearance, but in tough years like this, that might be valuable. I've also seen this where they'll wrap up, because it's interesting. You'll see most of the damage on the lower part. This actually, I've watched this belt here for a number of years at this building site. And the ones that they've got that burlap screen in front of seem to have done well. The areas where they haven't, they end up with a lot of winter injury. Now, by the way, and I don't know why this occurs, but when I go out and look at shelter belts, and I'll say, you know what, these trees need to be watered. And I'll hear, I can't water them. And I'm sympathetic. I realize that adds to the expense of trying to maintain a young belt. But the most common response to them is, well, can I fertilize? Fertilizer is not a substitution for irrigation. When people call me up or email me and they say, well, should I be fertilizing my trees and shrubs? Should I be fertilizing my shelter belts? That's probably really low on the list of things to do. For everyone here watching that's looking at trees in town in a lawn area, frankly, if you're fertilizing your lawn, you fertilize your trees. It's not that the lawn fertilizer just goes to the lawn and any tree fertilizer would just go to the trees. Elements are elements and everything will use them. And if you're fertilizing your lawn in the fall, that tree is any trees and shrubs in that landscape, excuse me, are going to get enough fertilizer. Shelter belts, it can be a benefit, but it's on the long list, the bottom of a long list of other things to do. So I would look at fertilizing as an addition, not a supplement, for more key areas like weed control and irrigation. Now, I often get asked about this. What about applying an anti-transparent? All right. Now, you can use these, and I just listed a number there. Not in any particular order or as a recommendation. In any particular one of these, there's a lot of different ones out there. This produces a film on the foliage of the plants, and we use them for evergreens and occasionally for some deciduous. But the idea is, excuse me, I got a tickle in my throat today. But what this is designed to do is reduce transpiration, that the plants will not give up the moisture that they're holding during the winter because you've got this film over top of them. Anti-transparent can cause a lot of damage if you use them wrong. So read and follow label directions if you're going to use them. And excuse me. And I might mention that they also can remove the blue coloration off blue spruce. So this would also be at the bottom of the list. I'd rather irrigate them than use an anti-transparent on them. But something that does work for everybody here that has ornamental trees is we do get cankers on the southwestern sides of the lower trunk, very common on thin bark trees such as maples and honey locusts. It's actually called Southwest disease, but it's not due to a pathogen. Where it gets the name is, and this is a great picture I took on the campus of SDSU. Here's a nice Freeman maple. And I took this picture in the wintertime. You can see the winter sun setting. Well, what happens is these thin bark trees, they don't have enough cork cells in those young stems to insulate. And so that bark, which in a sunny day in the wintertime is actually fairly warm, just like we stand on the south side of a building in the winter, it can actually feel warm. Well, the problem is when that sun sets, that bark temperature is going to drop very quickly to the air temperature, which is certainly going to be below freezing, and we get damage. In fact, the same tree, if you look at it from the other side, do you see that? It's on the southwest side, and it goes all the way down. Well, how do you protect a tree from that? That's where we'll wrap the trunk. Now, by wrapping the trunk, I really mean using a guard, a tube that goes around it. The studies have shown that anything you're literally going to wrap the trunk with, like this craft paper, does not insulate. What you need is something to create the insulation so that the tree doesn't warm up during the day. Okay? Well, there's not a lot of insulation in craft paper. Nobody watching this goes outside in the wintertime with a craft paper coat. And so the purpose of having this drain tile, just slit a drain tile and put it around, or buying a tree guard, is not that it holds to the trunk, but that you get a gap around the trunk. And you want to do it up to about the first branch, because the branches are going to provide some shade as well. So, you know, the usual, the 4 or 5 feet, but the biggest thing is the gap. You want an air gap in there. Why? Because that's going to keep that trunk from warming up. And that's the whole point. You're not trying to keep it from getting cold. You're trying to keep it from getting warm. Nice light color like this. Don't use a black drain tile. Use something white, or buy something that is white like this, and just have it around the tree so that you've got a little gap around it, particularly on the southwest or south side of the tree. I'm not so much worried on the north side. If it rests against it there, that's fine. But if you have that as that gap there, that air gap will prevent it from warming up. Now, notice I say once a tree is about 4 inches, that tree guard's no longer needed. By that point, the tree's got enough cork cells in it that it's well insulated and it'll make it. Needed, and I have italics there, for the winter. And my point is that the tube's only on during the winter. Don't leave it on during the summer. Particularly if it is a wrap. That can damage the tree quite a bit. So I know this is an extra bit of work, but putting the tube up around the tree just for the winter is going to help. And it's only the thin bark trees. Really, the maples and to some degree the honey locust will benefit from this. Many of our other trees, you don't need to do this on an oak, for example. It has a lot of cork cells already when they're young. But the thin bark trees do benefit from this quite a bit. But it brings up something else. This is, again, another Freeman maple, the autumn blaze maples, a lot of people think. And I get calls on this. There's these cracks in the bark. Well, they're not actual cracks. I mean, it'd be almost like if you took your finger and ran it down the trunk of the tree. And it's just this little indentation all the way down. That's normal for these trees. That's part of their bark characteristics. So you'll find these little seams, as I call them, on any side of the tree. You can find them on the north side, the south side, the east side, and the west side. And as the tree gets older, they seem to fade. But I've seen some trees that are very noticeable on, and it's not a defect. Freeman maples tend to do this, and so I find them on almost every tree. But surprisingly, people look at them and say, "Oh my goodness, got to be something wrong with that tree." Nope, nothing wrong to it at all. Well, for all the folks watching that are interested in shelter belts, let's look at tubes for them. But in this case, the tubing is different. What I just discussed is a tube you put around the tree in the winter to keep the trunk from warming up and then be exposed to that sudden drop in temperature as the sun sets. In this case, we're looking at tubes that do stay on for many years. These are tree tubes, as they're called. And this is a nice row with tree tubes on these. And what I like about them is the tree tubes are still on, because you really want that canopy to really fill out before you take the tubes off in this case. These are year-round, and so they're quite different from the first tube that I mentioned. Again, here's a great example, and I also want you to notice it's another shelter belt that has irrigation to it. As I mentioned, I'm seeing more and more belts going in with drip irrigation, and this is another one this year that just looks beautiful. And they're leaving the tubes on. Now, one problem with the tubes is that it does create that little greenhouse effect inside the tube. What happens is sometimes there's a little bit of a delayed dormancy in the fall. So what happens is those warm conditions in the tube, even though the day lengths are shrinking, the plant, quote, knows it should start going dormant. The fact that that trunk is warm will delay it. And I can remember some of the tubes back 20 years ago that were literally solid tubes, opaque tubes, and you get some light through. We would get winter kill on cottonwoods. Why? Because it stayed too warm in the fall in those tubes. So what did people start doing? Well, in the fall of the year, they'd start lifting the tube, get a little airflow through it, so that would help cool it. And that really took care of the problem. But then the tube manufacturers looked at it and said, hey, how about if we punch holes in it? And the holes do help, to a degree. They're not perfect, but they do help. But the interesting thing is, a very common question I get is, are the holes supposed to be at the top of the tube or the bottom of the tube? Frankly, I like them that they're all along the entire length of the tube. But if you're buying from a manufacturer where they have them maybe 2/3 of it, the holes are at the top of the tubes, not at the bottom of the tube. So this one is set correctly. You can see all the slits in this case, holes in the tube that are allowing for that airflow to help kind of cool it down. And again, I don't see the problems we used to have with plants not hardening off in time if they're put in tubes with holes in them. But the other thing you'll get with those is you get leaves, you get shoots growing up in there, and you can get a lot coming up. And so the other question I get is, can I prune them off? You bet you can. I recommend waiting till spring, but next spring, pull the tube up and prune off any sprouts, any suckers that are coming around the base. Why? Because you're going to get better airflow through there during the summer, and that's beneficial. And some of the lower branches that are bent, prune those off too. Now, you don't have to prune them all off. When you take the tube off, you can cut the rest of them off. But yeah, if it's all filled with leaves and that, you're not getting airflow through that tube, and you need airflow. So I recommend it in the spring, but if you did it right now, it's no big deal. But just think of that as one of your tasks to do, is go out there and try to trim off some of the branches and all of the suckers that are coming up around the base of the tree in the tube. And remember, the tube doesn't come off until a canopy has filled above the tube. In fact, some recommend leaving the tubes on until the base of the trunk has filled the base of the tube. So again, one common problem I see is tubes come off too early. When they come off too early, the tree, which hasn't developed its strength yet because it's always had that tube to help hold it, they just fall over in that. So the swaying of the wind in that upper canopy will actually strengthen the trunk of the tree. And that's why you want that canopy to expand above the tube. But there's a problem with leaving them in the tube. You can see this, the tree's actually starting to develop a pretty good trunk above it, but it's hitting the side of the tube continuously. And so we're getting a lot of damage. And you can see this has been happening over years. Now, what he tried to do is, can you see the top where he's crimped it back? In the perfect world, crimping actually reduces that. As you can see here, it really doesn't. But I got a real good tip from one of the producers in South Dakota that he's doing this. Now, by the way, he's doing this in response to some of the trees being damaged in the past. So you're looking at old injuries there. But what he does, he takes Gorilla Glue and foam, and he puts that around the top of the tube. And it works. I mean, what a simple solution. Now, I know someone's got to put that around every one of their plants. It's one more thing to do, but it's a very valuable thing to do, because then what you're not going to see is the top of the tree or the top of the trunk there being cut by the top of the tube. And this will actually ensure that, hey, you know, everything's fine. I'll leave it in the tubes longer. So you leave them in the tubes as long as you can for tree tubes in shelter belts. Well, you know, the original reason for developing tree tubes was critter damage. And last year, oh my gosh, the rabbit damage was incredible. There were rabbits everywhere, and they were doing this. That's an apple tree. Better was an apple tree. It's dead now, because once they go all the way around the trunk of the tree, and if they go in deep enough, you've girdled the tree. You've killed it. What they like is that phloem tissue, that inner bark. It's kind of a darker color, and that has a lot of sugars in it. Now, a lot of times you don't see this damage until spring. You might even notice the snow here is kind of that crusty snow of spring. Has a lot of moisture in it. It's gone through a couple of freezes and thaws. In the spring of the year, there's an awful lot of sugars in that inner bark, in that phloem tissue. And so that same bark in December may not be tasty, but in March or early April, before anything else is around in the ground to eat, this is like a Snickers bar. Think of that. All right, you got nothing to eat and somebody waves a Snickers bar in front of you. Yeah, I'll go for the Snickers bar. And that's what they do. They girdle the whole thing. And I get people say, "Oh, you know, I went through the whole winter and they didn't do anything." Well, it didn't taste like a Snickers bar yet. Once it starts to, they're going to go for it, particularly if there's no other food. If we get an early spring and everything greens up, they'll move to grass. They like salad rather than Snickers bars. But this last winter, it was a long winter and there were a lot of bunnies. So there was a lot of damage. Voles, by the way, are another problem that we have, particularly on our cedars. If anyone's out there got junipers in their yards or cedars in their belt, you're going to find vole damage. Now, voles will actually make irregular chew marks in it, and you'll see these long lines, and it's going to be very low to the ground, of course, because these are going to be under the snow. The other problem, too, I might mention is if the tube of your tree tube is not on the ground, you've actually created a nice little home for voles, and you'll see more vole damage. So make sure it's pressed to the ground, not into the ground, but to the ground when you're doing the tree tubes. But seen a lot of damage on cedars to voles. Last winter was a critter winter. We had lots of things. And so look at this. Here's a belt I looked at of cedars, and you went down the row this spring, and you can see these individual cedars were dead. And they go, well, why'd these die? And you pull away all the grasses underneath it, and that's a clue right there. And pull all the grasses away and find the trunk, and it had been girdled, chewed all the way around. Now, what do? Well, first of all, you make sure there's no hiding cover underneath her. If you can, try to get any grasses away from the trunk. And I know that's difficult, particularly on cedars. The other thing you want to do is mow. This fall, before winter sets in, that grass alongside of the strips there should be mowed almost flush with the ground. Cut it close, because what you're reducing is hiding cover for the voles. I see more vole damage when we get lots of grasses coming up around the base of these seedlings. And then certainly if the grass is kept very tall between the rows. So mow them tight this fall to reduce hiding cover for the voles. You can also use bait stations. I prefer those than just putting bait out, because lots of other things can eat the bait. A number of our supply companies that sell pesticides and that do sell bait stations for voles. And so if you're interested in trying to reduce the vole damage in your young belts, you might want to check whoever you buy your pesticides with and see what bait stations they're selling, and utilize those following the label directions on them. But I will say they work very well. Rabbits, well, they're a little easier to spot because you always got the poop around. Looks like little Cocoa Puffs. You find those, you know you've got bunny damage there. And sure enough, on those, you've got the two grooves from the incisors. You notice that as you look down there, you can see that it's kind of like chop, chop, chop. And on this one, this is a winged euonymus. Burning bush is another name for it. Rabbit candy is probably the best name of all. And it's true. Rabbits love this plant. This has got to taste like the best Snickers bar in the world, because they'll go for this over anything else. And this year it was so bad and we had to snow deep enough, they literally went up and down these plants. I mean, we saw damage 3 feet off the ground because the drifts were that tall. and it damaged them, and they didn't come back. They're dead. Or this, look at this belt. Now, you'd expect to see that in a belt like that, wouldn't you? I mean, look at all the hiding cover nearby. The rabbits could go through it. And by the way, maples are another favorite. Excuse me. Now, the question I get asked, particularly on belts like this, you can see some of the stems were not affected, others were. What do? Well, in the spring of the year, you cut the ones that were girdled to the ground, and the plant will be fine. I mean, it'll sprout back up. But any of these any ones that they fed more than 2/3 the way around, I don't care about the height, but 2/3 the way around, you might as well cut them to the ground and let them resprout. And this again is an amber maple, and you can see why they got as much damage as it did. It's like being at a buffet plate with Snickers bars. They can go the whole length, and there's good hiding covers in case someone's trying to chase them out of the line. And more. The Cotoneasters, they just love as well. By the way, rabbits will browse at about a 45-degree angle because those incisors. And so if you're wondering, am I looking at rabbit damage or am I looking at deer damage? The angle of the cut will tell you that. Deer don't have those incisors, and so they tend to tear tissue away. If you take a look at the needles there on this Mugo pine, well, this is rabbit, excuse me. Those are cut clean. I'll show you deer in a moment. Apologize, I got ahead of myself here. The deer one, they'd look more like tearing, like literally they pulled it out. Rabbits, it looks more like they snipped it right off, which is what they do. If anyone's concerned about rabbit damage in the coming winter, the best products are ones that are for fear rather than taste. I mean, we had so many rabbits last winter. If you just put something out and said this doesn't taste good, they'd still eat it. What you want is something that they go, I don't want to hang around here because something's going to kill me. So products that are dried blood work extremely well. Anything with a rotten egg odor is the same thing. And you can find various recipes that you can follow, that you take 6 eggs and mix them together and set them out for a bit until they smell that real sulfur smell and spray it. This material has to be frequently reapplied, and you're better off getting it on in the fall. Once the rabbits have started feeding, for example, you say, oh my gosh, I went out in March and I noticed the rabbits are starting to feed on my burning bush. Spraying at that point, it's too late. They've already found it's a good food source. They've already been by it and feeding on it. They're figuring they're pretty safe and continuing to feed on it. Get them used to not going there is the best thing before it tastes like a Snickers bar. So don't wait until you see damage to start using these repellents. Anticipate that you're going to see damage and use the repellents early on. Deer, it's more of a tear. I mean, think of it as they kind of pull it so you don't get that crisp, clean bite. That's what I meant for deer. Notice there it's more of a tear pulling. And the deer were browsing. They were browsing spruce this last winter. And they normally don't go for spruce. That's starvation food. But they were yarding up in a lot of belts. And quite honestly, had you even sprayed those belts, you still would have gotten damage. I mean, they would eat almost anything. They were so hard pressed to find food. And look at this. That's ash in a windbreak. And they called me because they said, our ash trees go sideways. They don't grow up. Well, it's right next to a huge huge cedar belt. Well, you had so much hiding cover in there, they're going to come out and browse us. They'll browse ash. They love hackberry and oak. If you say, John, I want to put something in my shelter belt that will attract deer, put oak and put hackberry. You don't put ash anymore anyway because of emerald ash borer, but yeah, hackberry and oak, deer will love you. because those must taste just great to them. Oh, and they will go after some trees such as Myers spruce. The spruce, you know what they do? They shear them. I've gone out and looked at a number of belts. White spruce, they'll do the same thing, not blue spruce. The needles are too sharp. But they'll call me up and ask you, how come my spruce look like just beach balls and don't get any bigger? That's deer. Get out in the fall, spray those with the repellent because they're small enough, they're beach balls, and hopefully you can discourage them. The problem is they've already know where this food is and they've hit it in past winters. It's going to take a lot to strike the fear into them going back. Oh, and this one I just looked at about 2 weeks ago. It's a hackberry, one of Bambi's favorite foods. And it's in a tree tube. It's in a 4-foot tree tube. And the producer said, my hackberries just aren't growing. It's been this way for 8 years. 8 years it's been that way. Well, look at the top. You can see it's a deer salad. At 4 feet, they could nibble the top year after year after year. The tree's lived, but you've got just like a little toupee on top of that tree tube, and that's it. There's bur oak, again, another tree they just love. And 4-foot tubes, that just holds the leaves right where they want them. So 4-foot tree tubes aren't going to really help you with deer. In fact, look at this. This is a perfect picture. Now, what I liked about this belt, and by the way, excellent belt, but in the same row of hackberries and the same row of oaks, the producer used 5-foot tubes, 4-foot tubes, and no tubes. You probably know what the no tubes looked like. They were ground covers, about 3 or 4 inches tall, and that's as big as they've gotten over the years. The 4-foot tubes, you can see they look chowed. See in the background, the 5-foot tubes? Look, they're getting above the deer, aren't they? Now, by the way, you get enough snow, the deer can stand on top of them. Even a 5-foot tube isn't going to do it. But when you read any of the instructions for the tubes, they'll all identify that 5-foot tubes minimum, and that's usually about the largest or the tallest size you can find. Minimum is what you need to reduce deer damage. So for me, particularly on the trees they really like, I wouldn't plant anywhere in South Dakota a bur oak or a hackberry in a 4-foot tube unless you want to be standing out there hunting deer. Because they'll just browse the tops every year like this. They'll look like these little cone heads to it. And again, here's bur oaks and 5-foot tubes. And the 5-foot tubes, they were getting ahead of it. You know, they needed a few years to do that, but 5-foot tubes, those are the best. I don't know if you can see it too. This is a tube which is different. Rather than the sluts, it's using holes in the tubes for that venting. And once again, the holes are in the upper half of the tube, not in the lower half of the tube. Don't flip them over. I want the holes near the top, not near the base, because I want that air to flow out. And the thing, it doesn't matter what you do. Deer are going to rub. Tube will protect the trees from that too, of course. But when you get them out of the tube, I see more problems in urban areas. And of course, they're marking territory. So that's a hard thing to discourage when they're out there doing that. And then what about squirrels? That's a final one we saw problems with this last year. Squirrels will nip off the tips of branches. It'll look a lot like rabbits. I mean, it's cleanly cut, but there's no rabbit that's up 40 feet. So this is squirrel damage. And they'll go through and nip the pine tips off during the wintertime. They also like hackberries, I might add. They also like maples. They like a lot of the same plants that rabbits and deer like. So that Snicker bar thing must really fit. And here they are chewing away here. And look at this. We actually lost trees this last winter to squirrels. The pressure was so bad. They love maples. and they love buckeyes. Believe it or not, the two trees are closely related. Apparently, they must have the same taste because squirrels would go after the maples, and that's a maple in McCrory Gardens, and they also did the same thing on buckeyes at McCrory Gardens. And then elms. Look at that. That's squirrel gone wild. Okay, last item here as we finish up, and I always like to leave a little time for questions if there are any. And again, as always, certainly appreciate your attendance here today. Is for all those folks looking for putting in shoulder belts next year, a reminder, particularly on these two products, atrazine or picloram, commonly sold as Tordon, among others, carryover. This year, as I have with many other years, I've gone out and looked at belts with a lot of dying cedars, for example. And I go, what was this ground last year? And they say, oh, it was corn. Was atrazine used? Oh, well, yeah, mid-season. And then I test the foliage, and it's filled with atrazine. Atrazine's a good way to kill a lot of evergreens. Interesting enough, won't kill cherries. I've gone down rows, and every cedar's dead, and the next row's cherry, and they're fine. I'm probably looking at atrazine. So the point of this is that if you're looking to put shoulder belts in for people, check for this chemical. Now, if it was pasture land, make sure they didn't use Tordon the season before. And this year, I've looked at both where the producer even acknowledged that, hey, I used Tordon last year, or I used atrazine last year. Well, you know what that means? You're not planting for 2 years. 2 years. So if you're working on somebody's shoulder belt for next spring and they used atrazine this summer, you're not planting next spring, 24. You're not planting in 25. 26 would be the conservative. Now, I'm not going to tell you you couldn't get away with a 25 planting, particularly as long as it didn't include plants such as cedars, which are very susceptible. But still, the safest would be waiting 2 years. You'd be doing it in 26. So these are kind of important. Nobody likes to go out and look at a shoulder belt that it's turned completely brown, and it's all because of the fact they have carryover for herbicides. But I think we'll have a separate session just for that. It can be such a problem. So with that, I certainly appreciate you attending today. I apologize for the tickle in my throat here. Today I didn't drink enough coffee or water, and had a couple hours of lecture, so my throat was a little dry, and again, apologize for that. If you're an ISA member and you're looking for CU credits for today, in other words, you watch the live presentation, the ISA CEU code is DS-23-024, and the title is Preparing for Winter. Again, as a reminder for all the folks doing the ISA self-reporting, the title has to be exactly as I've written there. We've had a few of you just kind of jot down roughly what the title was, and then found ISA wouldn't accept it, and we'd have to go back and help them with that one. They're very picky. The title that was submitted for the CUs much match that title. So Preparing for Winter, DS-23-024 for the live presentation. So you saw it today that you're submitting it. So Tony, with that, we'll finish up. We might as well leave that slide on for a bit. I don't know if we have any questions for today, because we're probably, with the 80 degrees we're going to get next week, it's hard to think of winter, but if we have any questions, let's go through them.
You know, I just have one question that popped up in the chat so far, Dr. Ball, and that is, what do you do with a black walnut tree that have large black ants on a branch?
On a branch. Now, that's kind of interesting because we often get carpenter worms, or carpenter ants, excuse me, But you know what I'm thinking it might be, Tony, is if they're seeing a lot of ants on a branch, I'll bet there's aphids on that branch. This year we had a huge blowout of aphids.
Yeah.
And particularly on those cedars, I'd go out and look at a cedar tree and I'd be, what are all these ants on it for? And they were actually milking the aphids. For the rest of the viewers here, ants will herd aphids. They'll protect them from predators. But why do they herd them? They milk them for their honeydew. That sweet substance, sweet for an ant. And so I'll bet you a dime that same walnut or that same branch in the walnut, it may be sticky on the ground beneath that branch, or if they see any of the leaves, it might have a little bit of shine to it, which means that you have an aphid colony up there.
That's
And
right. Our participant who asked the question, she said, yes, it was aphids. And so what sort of treatment would you do for an aphid issue, if any?
Well, usually it's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I've already seen a number of cases where I've gone out and looked and there's ladybug larvae out there feeding away. And it's just driving the ants crazy because they can't stop them. So most aphid problems, if you just leave it alone, will resolve itself naturally. There's lots of things that like to eat aphids. Unfortunately, a lot of the sprays that we use are very good at killing things that eat aphids. So unless this becomes a persistent problem that you see it every year, I would probably just wait it out and let nature take care of the aphid problems. And once the aphid problem's gone, the ants will be gone as well.
Perfect. I don't see any other answers or questions rather at this time. If anybody does have a question that pops up, you have Dr. Ball's information, you have my contact info, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for your time. We hope everybody has a good fall here, and please join us on the next episode.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and enjoy the warmer temperatures next week because sooner or later it will be cold. All right. Thanks, everyone.